From the late 19th century until the latter half of the 20th century, the Canadian River, the Santa Fe Railroad, and cattle ranching, symbolized today by Canadians' annual rodeo, defined the history of Canadian and Hemphill County. Isolated by its rugged geography that made its land difficult to reach, the region developed perhaps the most interesting and unique history of any place in the Texas Panhandle. Dinosaurs probably once ruled the region that comprises Hemphill County today, but any fossil evidence of them eroded away millions of years ago. However, abundant fossil remains of early land mammals survive at several locations. The Canadian River, the most important tributary of the Arkansas River and the only river that crosses the Texas Panhandle, usually shallow and difficult to cross because of the quicksand during the late 1800s until the mid-1900s, swelled into a mighty torrent during flood times. Even so, Native Americans lived and hunted bison and farmed along the Canadian River and its many tributaries for at least 14,000 years before buffalo hunters began pushing into the Texas Panhandle in 1873. Plains Indian tribes depended almost wholly on the shaggy beasts to supply their necessities of life, so the wanton killing of bison for their hides predictably angered the native tribes. The resulting cultural clash culminated in the Red River or the Buffalo War of 1874 to 1875, and the Indians' final realization that their only hope of survival lay in settling down on reservations in the western part of Indian Territory. Ranchmen soon drove herds of cattle into the region vacated by the Indians and buffalo. In fact, the very first ranch in the Texas Panhandle was established in 1875 in what became Hemphill County the next year. As Hemphill County's most important industry for decades, ranching provided thousands of head of beef cattle each year and accounted for a major source of the county's wealth until the late 20th century. Farming also began on a limited scale by 1880 and developed into another important source of income by the early 1900s. The construction of barbed wire fences during the 1880s hindered the driving of cattle from the Texas Panhandle to railheads in Kansas, and it became obvious that the region needed a railroad of its own. As a result, the Southern Kansas Railway, a subsidiary of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, constructed tracks from Kansas into the Panhandle in 1887 to Canadian and as far as Panhandle City in Carson County. The founding of Canadian by the railroad in 1887 and the rapid influx of new settlers soon filled Hemphill County with enough residents for its organization that year, and Canadian became its county seat. Like ranching, the Santa Fe Railroad played a major role in the county and city's economy and daily life for more than a half century. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, Canadian became the largest and most important town in the northeastern Texas Panhandle, with a variety of commercial endeavors including many stores, banks, restaurants, saloons, and newspapers, as well as lawyers, physicians, and a hospital. There also were public and private schools, several churches, a chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Wealthy ranchers and successful Canadian businessmen constructed many beautiful houses and commercial buildings in the city. During 2 world wars and several smaller wars, Hemphill County ranchers helped supply beef for the military forces as well as the people at home. and the county provided many young men to aid in the nation's defense. Between the World Wars, the Great Depression, and the Dust Bowl of the 1930s challenged the local economy, but the region benefited from several New Deal programs, including the construction of Lake Marvin at the junction of Boggy Creek and the Canadian River during the late 1930s. From 1939 until the mid-1960s, the construction of 3 dams, 2 in New Mexico and 1 in Texas, tamed the Canadian River forever, but turned its former bed into a marshy jungle of grass, weeds, and trees. During the 1950s, the Santa Fe Railroad moved its shops and freight office to Amarillo and shut down its passenger depot, robbing the city of thousands of citizens and millions of dollars annually. A major drought during the early 1950s severely crippled the cattle industry. Then, the development of a major petroleum industry during the latter half of the 20th century replaced the raising of cattle on many of the county's ranches. Now, in the second decade of the 21st century, Hemphill County and Canadian have survived hard times and enjoy prosperous ones, and the region remains one of the most interesting and unique in the Texas Panhandle.